why did Donald Trump start a new Cold War against China? Then the question becomes, why did Joe Biden, when he became president of the United States, not only not abandon the new Cold War against China that Trump had started, but actually escalated, turbocharged it? Answers that the New York Times and the Washington Post and the Times of London give are pathetic. Taiwan, or national security, or Chinese spying, as if those were not problems 20 years ago, 15 years. So that's completely unconvincing. As I said, it's a pathetic explanation. I mean, the Chinese position on Taiwan has never changed. Closely, and of course influenced and biased by my technofeudalism hypothesis. It seems to me that China poses, for the very first time in the history of global capitalism since 1971, a clear and present danger to the dominance of the dollar payment system.
Hello and welcome to another episode of India and Global Left. Today we have with us a very special guest, Yanis Varoufakis. Yanis is a professor of economics and an author of several books. He was the former finance minister of Greece and the co-founder of international grassroots movement DiEM25. Since 2019, he has been leading his parliamentary party in Greek parliament. Yanis, welcome back to India and Global Left.
Well, thank you for having me.
All right. Let's discuss your recent book, Technofeudalism. And it's an interesting book because your last book that we discussed was Talking to My Daughter, A Brief History of Capitalism. And this book is saying that it is beyond capitalism. So in a way, it's a great rupture. So you wrote a book about explaining to your daughter what capitalism is and how it works. And now you have written a book explaining to your father, presumably your late father, having this dialogue, fictitious dialogue, explaining why it has moved beyond capitalism. So tell us, why did you decide to write this?
For a number of years now, I've been feeling in my bones that capital has been so triumphant, like a highly toxic virus, which has mutated into a form that, like Ebola, kills off its host very quickly. You see, I'm talking to leftist comrades, so let's speak the language of the left to one another. We leftists came on this planet, or that's what we think, in order to overthrow capitalism and to replace it with something better. We used to call it socialism, communism, whatever, economic democracy, participatory economic forms of production and distribution, whatever you may call it, something better than capitalism, something that is not based on systemic and systematic exploitation. And we lost, let's face it, everywhere. The communist left, the non-aligned movements in Asia, in Africa, the social democrats in Europe, the liberals, as they call themselves, the social democrats in the United States, who've all lost, and capital has triumphed. And yet, because of this mutation, we have a delicious irony. While capital is triumphant, it is so toxic that, in my view, it has decimated that which we mostly agree constitutes capitalism, which is what? It all depends on the definition of capitalism, right? Capitalism knows the markets. We Marxists know that. We've always had markets. Since time immemorial, they've been markets, but not capitalism. What makes capitalism capitalism is, first, that the fuel of the economic system is, for the first time in human history, profit, not rent, not extracted value, extracted by political military means as under feudalism, whether Asiatic feudalism or European feudalism. Instead, entrepreneurship builds up capital Capital accumulation gives the owners of capital the capacity to create magnificent new wealth and at the same time to extract surplus value from those who produce it. So profit and markets in which all economic activities are channeled. Under feudalism, there was no such thing as a labor market. People worked, but they didn't sell their labor for a wage. They simply kept part of their produce. But there was no wage under feudalism, any form of feudalism. So there was no labor market. There was really not even a capital market. There wasn't even a real estate market, in the sense that either you were born into the landed gentry and you inherited the land, or you weren't born into the landed gentry, in which case you never had land. So there was no classifieds either for labor or for land. So the market was peripheral. There were societies with markets, but they were not market societies. They were not capitalist societies. So markets and profit is what makes capitalism. And, about 8 years ago, 7 years ago, 6 years ago, I started feeling that with the rise of three things. Firstly, big tech, Silicon Valley, Google, Apple, Facebook, and so on. That's one thing. Secondly, quantitative easing. After 2008, 2009, central banks printing lots of money. That has never happened before. We're talking about $35 trillion printed between 2009 and 2022. And the third thing was the rise of private equity. That is, mega companies that don't produce anything, like State Street and Vanguard and BlackRock, who own up to 80, 90% of all the companies in the New York Stock Exchange. If you take these three things together, what you have is a replacement of profits by rent and of markets by digital platforms like Amazon, like Alibaba, and so on and so forth. Because these are not markets. You enter Amazon.com, you exit capitalism. You enter a digital fiefdom belonging to a single man called Jeff Bezos, who matches you as a consumer, as a customer, with some producer or producers, but you don't have the capacity to have a direct link with them. And that producer, a capitalist, gets his or her profit schemed in the form of what I call cloud rent, as opposed to ground rent, by Jeff Bezos. And this money comes out, is extracted from the circular flow of national income or international income, and it's stashed away as a rent. So that, what I say to my audience is, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to technofeudalism. This is no longer capitalism.
Yeah, it was a very interesting read. I mean, I was reading these days a lot about the emergence of capitalism. So going back into, 1700, maybe 1600, 1500, and people keep on pushing it back. And the literature is very divided now between essentially two camps. One that sees this period between 1200 to 1700 as something non-feudal, because for them emergence of markets, towns, finance, and so on actually meant that there was a transition from feudalism. And then there is the other camp, mostly led by classical Marxists, who said that even the rise of markets, towns, were predicated on the consumption of the elites, the feudal elites, and the bulk of the economy was still based on peasants, safety first principle and so on. So it's a debate that goes on. And so while I was reading your book, I was also thinking, at the back of my mind, if like there is some debate of that sort, maybe, we'll continue to see in the future. But let's stay with your claim that we are seeing a predominance of rent and not profit. And you write in your book that profit is subject to market, while rent is something which is a matter of privilege. Explain to us a little more about this difference, because you say it's a qualitative difference. Quantitatively speaking, there is no such difference.
Allow me a small comment on your intro,
Sure.
the intro to your question. Look, for me, this is not an interesting debate. Was there capitalism in the 13th century, 14th century? Absolutely not. And anybody who thinks that simply, is a bourgeois thinker who likes to look into the past and find capitalism in Noah's Ark, in, ancient Athens. If you are really interested in looking at Noah's Ark or, the Jungle Book or ancient Athens and finding capitalism, you will. But you are simply destroying any chance that you have of understanding what capitalism is. Capitalism would never have happened if it wasn't for the enclosures, the massive eviction of peasants in England and Wales and Scotland, and thus the creation for the first time, of a proletariat, and the creation of land whose value was directly linked to a commodity called wool, which was exchanged with Indian silk and Indian cotton and so on. So I'm, to all intents and purposes, I'm.
This is the Robert Brenner camp, like within the debates about emergence of capitalism.
Marxist camp. If it's a Marxist,
it's the Marxist camp.
Yeah, it's a Marxist camp. It's Karl Marx, right? But also Adam Smith and also David Ricardo. They're all the classical political economists. I mean, why was there no Adam Smith before the 1770s? Because there was no capitalism before the 1770s in need of a purely economic explanation. Okay, now to your question about the profound difference between rent and profit. Look, it's really very simple. If you own a block of flats in the middle of Paris or Manhattan or Mumbai, for that matter, anywhere, competition and growth is your friend. You don't have to do anything. You just wait. Other people do entrepreneurial things. They build cafes, restaurants, businesses, stock exchanges, banks, whatever, in the vicinity where your building is. And the more capitalist growth there is, the more investment is by others, the higher the returns to your real estate asset, whether it's rent or whether you're selling it. Okay, you don't have to do anything. You get richer in your sleep. And growth and competition are your friend. You get richer the more other people do and invest in. But if you're making binoculars or, this pen, right? And you're living, your surplus comes from trying to make these more competitive pens in the pen market, then if you find out that there's been more economic activity, more competition in your market, then you're in trouble, because it means that your sales are going to suffer, or your revenues will suffer. So that is a profound difference. If you are renting an apartment in that block of flats in Mumbai or London or Paris or Athens, wherever, if you are the renter who rents it in order to house their business, competition is your enemy. And you are constantly threatened by it, and your profit margins are constantly squeezed. If you're the owner of the building, you don't need to do anything. You just sit back and you effectively siphon off the economic activity from wages and for profit. So you're a parasite. Now, the fundamental difference between feudal lords and techno-feudal lords, between the lords of the land back in England or France or wherever in the medieval period, and Jeff Bezos or Apple or Google or any of those big tech companies, the fundamental difference is that the landed gentry, the feudal lords of yesteryear, didn't have to invest in it. They just had to be born in the right family in order to own the land. Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk, Steve Jobs before that, and now Tim Cook and all those people, Bill Gates, they are entrepreneurs. They're capitalists. They have invested massive amounts. Well, a little parenthesis here, 90% of what they invested was printed by our central banks, right? It didn't come from profit. Right. And that's why I mentioned quantitative easing and money printing before. Close the parenthesis. But nevertheless, they invested. They built up huge amounts of capital, innovation, technology, R&D, algorithms, AI, you name it, high-tech capital. But this capital is a new form of capital. It's a kind of capital that never existed before, not because it's technologically advanced. Because if you compare and contrast an industrial robot, which is building Tesla cars or iPhones in Shenzhen, that industrial robot is hugely advanced. It's based on software. There's probably artificial intelligence involved somewhere in it. It is a magnificent device at the forefront of technological innovation. And yet, it's not that kind of, it's closer to steam engines than it is to the software running Amazon.com. Even though technically they're very, very similar. Why is it closer to the steam engine? Because like the steam engine, the industrial robot building Teslas and iPhones is an example of a produced means of production. It's a machine that we built to build other machines, right? But what's residing into your Google search engine, into your Facebook, into your TikTok, is a produced means, not of production. It's not producing anything. It's a produced means of behavioral modification, which acts as what? On behalf of its owner, Bezos, for instance, what does Alexa do, which is sitting on your desk connecting you to Amazon, to the Amazon servers and all that capital, which are called, by the way, cloud capital, because it supposedly lives in the cloud.
Buys my attention, manufactures my attention.
It manufactures your desires. It captures your attention. It trains you to train it, to train you, to train it to understand you better and give you advice, which is good. Because when Amazon.com suggests books that I should read, it's always spot on. It knows what I want to read. Similarly with Spotify, the music it suggests to me is usually music that I like. And therefore, because we are very impressionable, we human beings, the moment the machine gives us good advice which, when we have followed it, we have benefited, we are open to its advice. So suddenly it can manufacture for us, in our soul, in our bosoms, desires for things, and at the very same time, something that no advertiser could do in the past, it can sell it to us directly, bypassing all markets. So by investing in this cloud capital, Jeff Bezos has created a digital fiefdom, which is a platform for selling and buying things, which is outside the marketplace, which gives him an opportunity to charge capitalists that are selling their wares to us through Amazon.com a majestic, magnificent, very large rent, which I call cloud rent, the equivalent of the ground rent that feudal lords used to charge vassals and peasants under old-fashioned medieval feudalism. Bezos uses the cloud capital to create a digital fiefdom so as to be able to charge cloud rent to capitalists and to make us provide free labor in order to produce the cloud capital, which modifies our behavior. It is fascinating, and it would have been fantastic had it not been so gruesome.
Yeah, let's stay with this. So some of the things that you are saying, I'm actually having Brodell's understanding in Civilization and Capitalism. And what he was saying is that there is this very top layer, which he referred to as the layer of anti-capitalist, which is like, your book is very Brodellian in that sense to my reading, like my eyes, because what you are saying is that there is this very top layer which violates all principles under capitalism. It violates principles of market. It runs on privileges of monopoly and stuff like that. And underlying that layer are these big or small businesses that still operates on profit and things like that. And I'm trying to think if what you are saying is entirely new, because on one hand, like, the scale is enormous. Anyone would accept that. But then, what Twitter does to us, in a way, what television or even traditional newspapers did with us, it's like manufacturing our taste, creating new fashion and so on and so forth, so that eventually businesses can sell actual product. The liquidity is not new, and this is why, rightly so, your book starts with in the chapter to this discussion about the changes after 1971. So enormous lending. Obviously, it goes to 2009 in terms of its massive scale, but some of the changes in the derivative market, in how banks became enormous and so on and so forth, were not new. So it's a part of finance capitalism. And finally, I would add um, monopoly. I mean, if you look at the long history of capitalism, starting with the chartered companies, monopoly is not something which was not there. Like monopoly has always been a big part of. And with monopoly comes privileges and all, so on and so forth. So why not? How is it so distinct from traditional understanding of finance capitalism? Because just to end my long question here, I'm also having like Arrighi's book in mind, where he refers to as cycles of accumulation. So there are these cycles where there is a material expansion. That would be your, post-war Fordist phase, which you say techno structure. And then there is the more financial side, where its capital shifts to more in the sense of rent seeking. That would be the global monitor side. So how is your understanding different from these kind of traditional understandings?
In two important ways. Allow me to explain why I think that
Absolutely.
this is not another phase of monopoly capital. It is not another phase of financialized capital. It is something profoundly different. Now, you mentioned the Bordelian view that at the top of the pyramid there sit anti-capitalists. That was always the case. Henry Ford hated the market. If he could, he would have destroyed it. Okay, he hated competition. He hated capitalism. He just wanted to take it all. Thomas Edison was a megalomaniac. He wanted to provide you not only with a light bulb that lights up your place at night, but also with a power station that provides the electricity. And if he could get the telephone companies and the roads and the banks and everything, he would have accumulated everything. He would have been, a one-man owner of everything, destroying all markets and all capitalism. There's no doubt. I mean, Schumpeter has explained that quite nicely as well. So that's
also
not
Marx's understanding of monopoly capital, like how competition would lead
well,
to
Lenin's and Rosa Luxemburg's, to be more precise. Marx, monopoly capitalism did not become a thing until after Marx's death, as we know. But anyway, look, this is not new. This is why in my book I compare two sets of three entrepreneurs. The first one is the standard monopoly capitalists of the 1910s and 1920s, people like Thomas Edison, Henry Ford, and Westinghouse. Right. And then I have, people like Jeff Bezos, Mark Zuckerberg, Bill Gates. In the second set, the people that I call techno-feudal lords. Now, what's the difference between? They are all megalomaniacs. They all wanted to be the rulers.
You write in your book, they have all inflated ego, like when you said that.
All have absolutely inflated ego. They all wanted to control the media. Okay, they all wanted to control politicians. So they all wanted to corner the market and reduce competition and effectively to become, as I said, the captains of the world. So there's no difference there. They all had massive amounts of capital. They were all financed through agglomerations of financial concerns that became even too big for their own interests. Banks that, in order to provide the massive financing that these sets of entrepreneurs needed, they had to conjure up huge quantities of loans out of thin air. And often that brought about huge financial crises as a result. So in that regard, there is no difference. The profound difference is twofold, however. First, if you compare, as I did before, I'll repeat something I already have said. If you compare, Henry Ford with Mark Zuckerberg or Jeff Bezos, Now, Henry Ford wanted to make every car you, your father, your mother, your siblings, your friends bought ever. He wanted to stop you from using public transport. That's why he paid municipalities to rip out the tramways, okay? And he wanted to sell you the cars. Now, Jeff Bezos doesn't care about what you buy. He doesn't want to sell you something in particular. He wants to replace the marketplace for everything without producing anything, but making sure that whatever you buy from other capitalists who are producing them and whom he charges 40% rent. That is a profound difference.
How is it different from the chartered company, the British East India Company or the Dutch East India Company? Was basically acting as mercantile player. Like I feel like the tech players
the Dutch East India Company was pre-capitalist, right? I'm talking about technofeudalism versus capitalism, not versus an extractive merchant circuit that the East India Company had created. The East India Company was a combination of a joint stock company and an imperialist state that had 200,000 soldiers that did all the looting on behalf. I don't think this is a good example of capitalism, the East India Company. It's a very good example of how British imperialism and Dutch imperialism and European imperialism started. But that's why I'm sticking. You see, you made the point about monopoly capital. East India Company is not a good example of that, but my Westinghouse, Ford, and Edison trio are a good example and need to be compared to the Zuckerberg, Gates, and Bezos set. So the one difference is that Ford, Edison, and Westinghouse were selling commodities to you directly and wanted to monopolize them. The techno-feudal laws don't care. They want to replace the market itself, with platforms that are not markets. The second major difference is that capital used by the monopoly capitalists had to be produced in workplaces employing waged labor. So if you wanted to build a car, or you wanted to build the production line itself, or the industrial robot today that builds cars, you had to have a factory in which waged labor was employed to produce means of production like it would produce any other kind of capital good or consumption good, right? The vast majority of the cloud capital, which is enabling Bezos, Zuckerberg, Musk, and so on, to extract these huge rents and not care about profits. The bulk of that, what I call cloud capital, is produced by us, by non-wage labor. This is a profound difference to capitalism. Capital by non-wage workers.
Excuse me. This is the difference between industrial and finance capital, right? What you are saying.
No. Finance capital is not capital. Hang on a second. We're Marxist here. Finance capital is not capital. I'm talking about capital. I'm talking about capital goods. I'm talking about machines. I'm talking about servers. I'm talking about optic fibers. I'm talking about capital. This is the first time in the history of the world where capital goods, machinery, and software and stuff, this thing which manages to change your behavior and operates as cloud capital is produced by wage workers, but to a very large extent, it is produced by unwaged users who think they're being consumers when they're not. And this explains to a very large extent why a company like Facebook or Meta today, of its revenues, it pays less than 1% in wages and salaries. Whereas a company like General Motors or Edison back then, or Volkswagen or Alstom or British Aerospace pays at least 85% of its revenues in wages. That is a profound difference. So we have a new form of capital, which has nothing to do with any kind of capital that existed before, cloud capital. And we have a new way of reproducing it, which never existed before. And we have on the basis of new cloud capital, which is being reproduced by a newfangled way, we have a new form of rent, which are called cloud rent, which is macroeconomically superbly significant in the sense that as we speak now, about 20% of global income is being siphoned off in the form of ground rent. David Ricardo would have been aghast at the idea that you have this kind of new form of rent, in addition to all sorts of other kinds of rents, ground rent, real estate rent, and so on. So I think this is a new regime. And I know there is a emotional attachment, especially by leftists like me, like you, to the idea that, oh, come on, Yanis, this is still capitalism. You can call it rentier capitalism, you can call it platform capitalism, digital capitalism, techno capitalism, whatever, but it is still capitalism. Well, this is an emotional reaction, I believe. And technically, it really doesn't matter what we call it, technically, because as I say in the book, if in the 1770s and 1780s, 1800s, if people refer to the new system not as capitalism, but as industrial feudalism, it wouldn't have been wrong. I mean, capitalism is a form of industrial feudalism. If you're a proletarian, you're a slave, a wage slave, or a wage peasant, as Marx would have said. So technically, linguistically speaking, it would not have been wrong to talk about a new kind of feudalism, an entrepreneurial, a market feudalism, an industrial feudalism. But I do believe that it was important to make the mental break that capitalism is separate from feudalism. And this is why I am taking the risk of talking about the transition, because of the predominance of cloud capital and the birth of cloud capital, to something which is separate from capitalism. I understand that, leftists in particular, who, as I said at the beginning, at the introduction of our discussion, we believe that we came to this earth to overthrow capitalism. We don't like the idea that something else overthrew capitalism, not us.
Right. Yeah. No, I mean, it's a remarkable book, especially in terms of shifting our focus to what's new and what's happening with the current state of our economy. And it's a very good analysis of the rise of the Black Rocks, or Vanguard, and so on and so forth, and how they have become the big players in the Wall Street. What does Amazon's or Meta they do with us, and so on and so forth. I think also the fact that profit has no longer been so important. I mean, my sense is that profit was always overhyped, because I mean, I look at for instance, the startup company, to go back again, whose corporate profit recorded was very, very low. British East India Company was relatively better, but the Dutch East India Company was always broke. And we know of many other companies whose recorded corporate profit was always low, but it was because of its market caps, as well as what its shareholders gets as dividends, that keeps them running. So I think you are very right in saying that, look, profit is no longer important. I would just add that maybe profit was never so important, or there were elements of both, like that there were corporations for whom like profit was the driving force, but there were corporate models which run largely on asset stripping and stuff like that. Just to end, we had 40 minutes, so we're almost running out of time. Coming to the book, you discuss, I mean, you can respond to what I said, but also take the question. Your book closes with a discussion of the global impact of technofeudalism and the Cold War in particular. And we are living in the middle of apparently endless wars. So lay out just for our viewers, what do you see as the global impact of technofeudalism?
See, one of the great questions that has been exercising my mind, and I'm sure it's been exercising the mind of many people, is why did Donald Trump start a new Cold War against China? Mm-hmm. And before somebody says, but Donald Trump is a madman, then the question becomes, why did Joe Biden, when he became president of the United States, not only not abandoned the new Cold War against China that Trump had started, but actually escalated, turbocharged it beyond belief with the microchip ban and all other moves that are clearly moves intended to signal to China, we will not allow you to become a technologically advanced country. We're going to crush you. That's the Cold War. Right? So why did that happen? The answers that the New York Times and the Washington Post and the Times of London give are pathetic. Taiwan, or national security, or Chinese spying, as if that those were not problems 20 years ago, 15 years ago, 10 years ago. There were certainly problems of exactly that sense when George W. Bush or Bill Clinton were opening their arms to the Chinese Communist Party and inducting them into the World Trade Organization, encouraging Apple to move all its production to Shenzhen or Shanghai or wherever, so that's completely unconvincing. As I said, it's a pathetic explanation. I mean, the Chinese position on Taiwan has never changed. Never changed. And indeed, nor has the United States, who does not recognize Taiwan as an independent state. It always thinks that it still follows their one China policy. So something changed. And looking closely, and of course influenced and biased by my technofeudalism hypothesis, it seems to me that China poses, for the very first time in the history of global capitalism since 1971 and the end of Bretton Woods, a clear and present danger to the dominance of the dollar payment system. And if you think about it, since 1971, the United States has had a magnificent run, a magnificent innings in cricket terms, because the first empire in the world that has managed to convince the rest of the world's capitalists or rich people to finance its expanding trade deficit because of the dollar payment system. Now, if you look at several applications, apps that are available in China as we speak, in particular WeChat, owned by Tencent, you'll find the beginning of the answer to the question. Because WeChat is an application that America doesn't have. It can do everything that Amazon, Google, Facebook, TikTok, Uber, Airbnb can do, Spotify, Netflix. You can do all of that. Mm-hmm. But it can do something else as well. It can enable you, if you're a user of WeChat, especially in China, to make any payment for free, independently of who you're banking with. Wall Street would never allow Apple to do that. Apple Pay costs an arm and a leg. And there's no such thing as free payments using any application that is available by Silicon Valley's big tech. If you add to that the digital renminbi, the digital yuan, the digital currency of the Central Bank of China, which upends the whole payment system. Because if you're a German producer who deals with China, either by selling stuff to China or buying things from China, or doing both, then a digital wallet by the Central Bank of China allows you to do free transactions, without having to go through, Deutsche Bank, the Bundesbank, the European Central Bank, the Federal Reserve, the Chinese Central Bank, some Chinese bank. Add to this mix, throw into this mix the war in Ukraine, which I'm not going to go into the details of the war in Ukraine. I'm simply going to say that this is the very first time that the West has confiscated hundreds of billions of dollars of a major central bank, that of Russia. I'm not going to comment whether they should do it or shouldn't do it, but only I'm going to say that they did it. So if you're a Saudi Arabian prince, if you're an Indonesian oligarch, if you're a Malay mega businessman, you suddenly worry. If you keep all your money in the dollar circuit, you think, well, today the Americans confiscated Putin's money. Tomorrow, maybe they will confiscate mine. That was not enough of a fear to shift everything. But we already have seen major, macroeconomically significant shifts of payments from the dollar system to the Chinese system. And that also is what lies behind the BRICS Bank, the BRICS Pay system, because of the BRICS, the only letter that matters is the C, right? The C in BRICS, referring to China, because they are the only ones who have a big tech and the banking system, which combined can put up this challenge to the dollar system. Now, for me, that is the explanation.
Mm.
And
this makes China very different from a Germany and a Japan in vis-a-vis relation.
Absolutely. Because let's face it, Volkswagen does not have a cloud that belongs to some large big tech German or European company, so as to connect, the cloud capital and the terrestrial capital in the way that Tesla does. Because let's face it, why did Elon Musk buy Twitter? It was not a crazy decision, as many people want. I mean, you may think that Elon Musk is...
You have a great explanation in your book about why did Elon Musk buy Twitter.
He saw Twitter as an interface, a piece of cloud capital that allowed him to combine the enormous amount of data that he gets from Starlink, from SpaceX, and from Tesla with a piece of cloud capital. And that, to me, makes better sense of what I observe around me geopolitically, in terms of the impact of the war in Ukraine, the new Cold War, and so on and so forth.
Last closing comments. What's the escape? That's also essentially the last chapter of your book. Just to place it in terms of a question, on one hand, there is this very violent clash, between two camps, if you like, within the cloud capital, right? One led by China and the other led by the US big tech feudal giants. And on the other hand, they are both leading us into a techno-feudal world. So what's the way out?
Well, this is a message that should act as a foundation for some kind of unity between me and my Marxist critics. The Marxist me and my Marxist critics, because the answer I'll give is a standard Marxist-Leninist answer. The answer is a combination of internationalism. There can be no solution at the nation-state level, given the ubiquity and globalization of cloud capital. So internationalism is the first strand, and the second strand is ownership, because there's no way you can regulate cloud capital. The age of social democracy is well gone, finished, kaput. The social democrats committed political suicide themselves by siding with austerity for the many and socialism for the bankers since 2008. So the social democratic road is closed. I don't care so much what big tech knows about me, about what Jeff Bezos knows about me, about what Google knows about me. I mean, of course, I respect people who are worried about the surveillance capitalism, as they call it. Yeah. But I don't care really what they know about it. What I do care about is who owns this cloud capital, which is so immensely capable of changing and modifying our behavior, which is, if you think about it, is the worst kind of false consciousness that you can have. And this is a purely Marxist term. So we need to reclaim the means of production and the means of computation and the means of behavioral modification and use these apps for the common good.
Right. The very fascinating term that you used was this new enclosures within the digital space, how one by one these spaces within the digital world was taken or enclosed by these big tech giants. But thanks so much for your time. We really appreciate it. Hope to see you again.
Well, thank you so much. It was a very enjoyable discussion. Thank you for the good questions.
Have a wonderful day ahead.
You too.